Hi, this is Rob Laubach, core instructor at the SOMA Institute in Chicago, Illinois. My video today is going to focus on the beginning principles and ideas behind kinesiology. As massage therapists, as body workers, working with the soft tissue of the body, it's important to understand the importance of kinesiology and how we treat our clients and how their bodies move. And when their bodies are not moving correctly, what can we do to correct those problems? So kinesiology is an important element in our work, and it's vital that we understand the principles behind it. So kinesiology, let's break the word down. Kines comes from a Greek, or kinesis, which means to move, movement. Logi means to study. So if we combine the two, movement and study, it's going to be the study of how the human body moves. Kinesiology, though, is a combination of different studies, of different sciences. And so we have to understand how those three components combine to give us the study of kinesiology. And to sort of explain that a little bit more, we're going to look at the deltoid muscle. So the anatomy of the deltoid muscle, okay, we're going to look at anatomy, physiology, and biomechanics. Those are the three components or the three sciences that build kinesiology. So we're going to look at the deltoid muscle in each of those. So anatomy, let's look at the anatomy of the deltoid muscle. It has attachments to the clavicle and to the scapula. It attaches to the humerus, and it is a teardrop shape. That's the anatomy of the deltoid muscle, where it is. The physiology behind the deltoid muscle is that through its contractile properties, its ability to contract, it produces a range of movements at the GH joint. That is its aspect in a physiological aspect. Then if we look at biomechanics, what are the mechanical forces at play? Again, still thinking of the deltoid muscle. The deltoid muscle, along with neighboring muscles such as the rotator cuff muscle, help stabilize the GH joint and produce primarily abduction of the shoulder. So that's kind of how you have to look at anatomy, physiology, and biomechanics to see how we look at the study of movement. And not just the deltoid, but all of the muscles in the body. All right, so let's look at different types of contractions. Okay, we understand that kines is the combination of three disciplines. So what types of contractions? If we're looking at movement, we have to look at contractions. So there are isotonic contractions and isometric contractions. Let's break down isotonic. Isotonic can be either a concentric contraction or an eccentric contraction. So let's look at those. Concentric is an acceleration. It's a faster kind of movement where origin and insertion get closer together. Whereas an eccentric contraction is origin and insertion getting further apart, and it's like braking. It's braking the muscle. It's trying to decelerate the movement that is happening. So you have to remember that sliding filament mechanism, right? Where the basic elements of a muscle, those muscle fibers, those filaments, start contracting and binding to shorten the muscle for a concentric contraction. So on an eccentric contraction, that slowing down, those filaments start to unlock. They unlock and the muscle starts to lengthen into its normal resting position. So always remember that sliding filament mechanism as well. And then finally, we have an isometric contraction, and that's a contraction where there is no movement that is occurring in the body. So I'm going to just show you very quickly with my arm, with my elbow, the difference in those three different types of contractions. And what I'd like to do is actually show it to you with regards to my triceps. Now, if I am in this position, we know that triceps extends the elbow. All right? So if I am kind of in trunk flexion, my elbow is bent. For an eccentric contraction to occur at my triceps, I'm going to slowly bring my elbow into extension. My triceps are concentrically contracting. Now, if I slowly bring that back down, my triceps are still contracting, but they are allowing this braking or this deceleration to occur. So, concentric, slow, eccentric. That's just of my tricep muscle. Now, if I wanted there to be no movement to occur, let's look at my bicep. So if I come into this position with a weight and I just hold it, this is a isometric contraction. There is no movement that is occurring at this moment. So I'm wondering if hopefully this chart may help you understand what is happening with eccentric and concentric contractions. You have to just kind of look at the color coding of the red and the blue, and hopefully this will help you understand. So this first red diagonal line, when the muscle is concentrically contracting, it is shortening. Okay? Through that sliding filament mechanism, those filaments are binding and the muscle is getting shorter. So shortening occurs. But we have to look at the other side of the body. So if this side is shortening and concentrically contracting, the other muscle on the other side of the body has to be passively lengthening. It's getting longer. So if you just kind of look across this X, it helps you understand what's going on. Concentric shortening, passively lengthening on the opposite muscle. Now let's look at eccentric. That was concentric. Let's look at eccentric. So as the muscle is eccentrically lengthening, right, it is slowing down, origin and insertion are getting further apart. The muscle opposite is passively shortening. So you just kind of look across these and you kind of understand what's going on with that. So for example, in my bicep, if I was letting the weight come down very slowly, that is an eccentric contraction of my bicep muscle, but for my tricep, it is passively shortening. One of the final things that we need to understand about muscles is one muscle is not an island to itself. A muscle doesn't work alone. It has to have friends. They have to work together in unison. So if smooth movement is going to occur, various things have to happen in different sets of muscles. So there's three important words that you need to understand when we're talking about muscles. One is agonist. An agonist muscle is a muscle primarily responsible for a certain action. Now that muscle can't do something all by itself. It's going to have to help some friends. And these friends are going to help that muscle out. So a synergist is a muscle that assists the agonist muscle. Now, on the other side of the body, there are going to be antagonist muscles. Muscles that will produce an opposite action of the agonist muscle. So it's important for the antagonist muscles to relax so that the agonist and the synergist muscles can take over and produce that action. So let's look at an example of how that works. The first part of the body that I want to show you and hopefully really help you understand the forces that are in play when the body is moving. So again, we're going to focus on an agonist muscle and antagonist muscle. So I'm going to ask my client to do just a very short, very brief, small contraction of his rectus abdominis muscle. He's going to do a crunch, just a little bit more for me. and relax. So we know that rectus abdominis is a narrow muscle attaching to the pubic bone and up to the xiphoid process. So remember, with a concentric contraction, origin and insertion are pulled closer together. So I'm going to have him do that again, but I'm going to use arrows to hopefully help you visualize the muscle and the force that is in play. So the muscle is going to be coming up like this, or is going to be contracting to lift his trunk. The force in play here is gravity. So then if I use this arrow, if I'll have my client do that crunch again, this is pulling and gravity is the force that's pulling against him. So that has to be a concentric contraction. Origin and insertion got closer together. Now, let's look at this in an eccentric contraction, a deceleration. So I'm going to have the client do that contraction one more time, and he's going to slowly lower his body. So as he slowly lowers his body, rectus abdominis is still contracting, slowing the movement against gravity. Now let's look at this movement of the body in a different aspect. We originally looked at it as my client laying supine on the table. Rectus abdominis was contracting concentrically, and the erector muscles were relaxing. Those are the antagonist muscles. So I'm going to have my client do the same action, but there's going to be different forces in play here. So I'm going to ask you to go ahead and just do a little bit of a bend forward. Stop about right there, okay? And then come back up for me. All right, so then let's use our arrows here to kind of figure out what's different about this than when he was laying on the table. So now, you may remember the first time when he was laying down, the abdominal muscles were contracting, okay? But now, force is here, and the muscles back here, his erector muscles, are eccentrically contracting to slow his movement down. If these were not contracting, he would basically just fall forward. So again, I'm going to have him go forward into that position. So this is pulling down while these muscles are contracting to slow his movement down. And come back up. So as this is moving forward, these muscles are passively shortening, and these muscles are eccentrically contracting, they're lengthening. Now that we've looked at just a basic trunk movement, let's look at an elbow movement. And hopefully this will explain concentric and eccentric as well. So I'm going to ask my client to do a bicep curl and then slowly lower that back down. All right, now let's remember biceps. Biceps starts in the shoulder. There's two origins, and then it attaches down to the radial tuberosity, origin, insertion. So when the muscle concentrically contracts, it accelerates. The origin and the insertion are coming closer together. During an eccentric contraction, when the muscle is slowing movement down or decelerating, origin and insertion are getting further apart. So I'm going to use my arrows again to hopefully help you visualize what's going on. All right, so the bicep is my muscle, and the weight is actually the force. So as he does a bicep curl, this is happening. The force is pulling, but because it's concentric, he overpowers force. And then as that starts to lower, this is still, the muscle is still contracting, the force is still being applied this way. So it is an eccentric contraction. Origin and insertion get further apart. Now let's look at what's happening one more time as he does this, what's happening to the triceps in the back? Okay, the triceps would be his antagonist muscles. So he's going to do a bicep curl again. So this is shortening. So what's happening posteriorly are the tricep muscles are passively lengthening. They are lengthening because the olecranon process is getting further away. As he eccentrically contracts here, the triceps are passively shortening. Continuing our look at various parts of the body, we're going to look at the cervical region now. I'm going to have my client slowly lift his head off of the table into cervical flexion, and then slowly lower that back down. So, what muscles produce cervical flexion? Sternocleidomastoid, anterior scalene. So, I'm going to use my arrows again to point out where the force is, where the muscle contraction is happening. So if you'll lift your head again, the muscle is pulling, gravity is the force here. Now, as he slowly lowers his head, again, this becomes an eccentric contraction of those same muscles. Just to review, origin and insertion are coming closer together against that gravity. He is overpowering gravity, so that is a concentric contraction. As he lowers his head, he's allowing the force to kind of take over and slowly lower his head. So in both instances, these anterior muscles are contracting. So when he lifts his head again into a concentric contraction, go ahead and do that for me, these muscles back here are passively lengthening. These are concentrically contracting. Now, let's look at this cervical movement again. You may remember when my client was laying on the table, the muscle force, the red arrow was here, and the blue arrow was here. But now that he's standing, this is going to actually change. So I'm going to have my client do that same type of action. He's bringing his head into flexion. Come back. So now you have to think about where your force is. Force is pulling here, while these muscles back here are eccentrically contracting. They're trying to slow down his cervical flexion. So if I used my arrows, here is my force, and here is the muscle eccentrically contracting. So if you'll do that action again, gravity is pulling down, and these muscles are eccentrically contracting to slow that down. So this is passively shortening, while this is eccentrically contracting. So let's look at one more part of the body. We've looked at some basic trunk movement, elbow movement, cervical movement. So let's look a little bit at some hip movement. So I'm going to ask my client, he's laying on his side, to just slowly bring his leg up from his other leg. So my client is moving into hip abduction or abduction. So for example, glute medius is contracting and pulling this forward. So I'm going to have him lower that back down. So let's look at visually for the arrows what's happening. Gravity is still my force here. So this is the force that he is trying to overpower. And so the muscle at work here, glute medius, is basically about here. So force is pulling here, and I'm going to have him do that action again. This is contracting to bring him into this position. Now, if he slowly lowers that again, here is the force still pulling. The force is winning. It's overpowering him. This is an eccentric contraction of that muscle as well. So just look at how origin and insertion get closer together or get further apart. So with glute medius, right, it's all around that iliac crest and attaches down to the greater trochanter. So you just think of origin and insertion getting closer together for that concentric contraction, and then as he lowers that leg, they get further apart, and it's trying to slow his movement down, as opposed to him just dropping his leg. Now, let's look at one more thing with adduction of the hip. This was abduction, right? So adduction is coming towards the midline of the body. So I'm going to have my client again bring this first leg up into abduction. Now, he's going to lift this lower leg off the table as well. He's going to engage his adductors now. So he's going to lift this up. Those adductors are nice and tight. Origin and insertion getting closer together. Now, he's going to slowly lower that back down. Those adductors are still engaged, letting him slowly go back to neutral. And then as he lowers this slowly, this is an eccentric contraction of that hip. So let's kind of put that idea of agonist, synergist, and antagonist into play. Let's look at it visually. So I have a pitcher of water on this table. I'm going to have my client very slowly try to basically reach out and pick that pitcher up. His shoulder is going into flexion. And stop. So what muscles are at play here? Well, I know that anterior deltoid, which does shoulder flexion, that's probably one of those first muscles that's kicking in. Okay? Now, if anterior deltoid was the only muscle contracting, if it was an island and it was by itself, the humerus is not going to move, because muscle innately, the tendinous ends of a muscle pull towards the middle. So if it was just deltoid, the humerus is not going to move. So let's add his friends in. Three important synergist muscles that help with shoulder flexion: the upper fibers of pectoralis major, biceps brachii, and coracobrachialis. Those all produce shoulder flexion. So I'm going to have him bring his arm back down, and again, he's slowly going to reach out, and look how anterior delt, biceps, upper fibers of pec major, coracobrachialis are helping produce that shoulder flexion. Now, we have to look at the antagonist muscles. So what are the antagonist muscles to shoulder flexion? Well, we've got to look at what muscles produce shoulder extension. Primarily, we would be looking at teres major and latissimus dorsi. So for my client to smoothly lift his arm, his shoulder into flexion, teres major and lats have to relax. The antagonist has to relax for that movement to occur. Now, he can pick that pitcher up now, and as he slowly lifts it up, these muscles again are really contracting. Here is that force, the pitcher full of water, and so he's contracting these muscles. These muscles back here, as he keeps going up, have to relax.